All right, thank you, everyone. I think we're going to get started, like a couple of minutes behind. Great. So thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Jessica Musengezi. I'm going to chair our session today. We've had a little couple of change up in the lineup. So I'll be taking over from Yuta Masuda, who was going to lead this previously. But I think we're really excited to present this symposium to you today. Our session today is really focusing on land tenure security and its relationship with conservation and human well-being outcomes. And I'll start off briefly by motivating our talk, and then I'll give you sort of a lineup of what are the talks that we're going to go through, and then we'll dive right in. And so land tenure security really is a complex topic. We find that it's one of those issues that's really at the nexus between conservation and human well-being, and it's unique in that aspect. It's also something maybe where we tend to think about rights, but it is more than just the legal rights, if we think about issues of land rights and restrictions. And at the same time, we're interested in not conflating land tenure form with land tenure security, with the form being private property, common property, some of those categories that we're familiar with, as we know that that may not always result in the outcomes that we're interested in. So it's also a complex topic in terms of practitioners or researchers trying to dive into the issue. It's complex in the sense that it's a disparate literature that's spread across many diverse disciplines. We can find that literature across conservation, forestry, international development, development economics, sociology, political science, and the list goes on. At the same time, there's no real standardized definition for land tenure security. We find that within different disciplines, people define it slightly different. So we have a difference in the language that we're using across disciplines. And so it's difficult for people to pull from those different disciplines of literature and get a good understanding of how this might relate to conservation. And then again, there's differing methods for studying land tenure security. Some people study perceptions, others may do legal analysis. So these differences in methodology present another challenge in synthesizing this information. And then again, if we think about land tenure security, it can also depend on the subpopulation of interest, so on your specific country context or your specific site location. So why should the conservation community care about land tenure security in particular? Well, we all know that people all over the world rely on land for their livelihoods and other aspects of their human well-being. The decisions that they make on their land both directly and indirectly affect the outcomes, both for our natural resources, things like soil, forests, wildlife, along with their livelihoods. And as conservation activities increasingly seek to tackle these complex issues, such as equity, inclusion, resilience, tenure security, is a key component of these issues. It's one of those issues that's cross-cutting and underpins most of these. The situation is the same whether you're looking at herders in Mongolia, whether these be smallholder farmers in Kenya, or US corn farmers. So it's something that's consistently cross-cutting globally. And ultimately, as conservation organizations, we must work with these communities who claim land rights, whether those be socially or legally defined. We can't really work around that. So we want to move towards a place where we can work with these in a way that's informed by evidence and science. And another reason I think tenure security is a unique aspect and important for conservation is that it's one of the entry points that can align conservation with global agendas. And one of the unique challenges of tenure security is that it's cross-cutting, right? So it cuts across many of the security development goals. If you want to be specific, SDG 1.4, one of those sub-goals, relates specifically to land tenure security. And it's a large literature that's out there that supports the link for tenure security with human well-being. But the challenge that we find is that the link between strengthening tenure security and conservation outcomes, it's mixed. So the amount of literature that we have there for well-being, we don't find that same attention being paid to conservation outcomes. So today's structure for the talks, we've got a lineup of 5 speakers today. I'm going to start off and sort of give you a high-level overview, a framework that we've developed for conceptualizing the relationship between land tenure security and human well-being. We'll follow up with Alison Kelly. She'll be taking over for Yuta Masuda, who can't make it today. And she'll talk about the tenure gap, which is the gap between socially defined and legally defined land rights. and the influence on socio-ecological outcomes. And then this will be followed by Alison Kelly. She'll do another one, back to back, kind soul, and talk about this important data layer, the governance context index, which we feel is filling a really important gap in evidence. And then we'll have an example of an impact evaluation from Ecuador coming to us from Kelly. And then we'll wrap up with a US example about non-operator landowners, which is a randomized controlled trial, a large-scale RCT, that's looking at these non-landowner operators and their lease rights and soil health. Okay, so let's dive in. Ooh. Sorry. How do I change to the next one? While you're setting us up, I'll just talk a little bit about the impetus for some of this land tenure work. And the next three following presentations, the one that I'll give and the ones that Alison are going to give, are products of the working group that we pulled together by the Nature Conservancy. And so this working group, we really recognize this need to address land tenure security in a more systematic way within conservation. And so we brought together some partners from across different sectors. We brought together environmental organizations, land rights and resource rights organizations, multilaterals, as well as some academic partners to delve into this issue. And so these are some of the products that we generated from that. So just to note that this is really a collective effort. A lot of really smart minds did some hard thinking about this, and we're excited to share this with you today. All right, so I'm going to look a little bit at a high-level framework about land tenure security. And the question we're really posing here is, does strengthening local land tenure rights help fulfill conservation goals? How can we think about this? As I mentioned before, if we take a step back and look at the context that we're operating in today, there's been a huge growth in global and local conservation policies, such as payments for ecosystem services programs. We have there highlighted programs like RED, the SDGs, which I already referred to, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Conservation, and all of these types of initiatives, many of them are contract-type mechanisms, and all of them rely on an external organization to influence local land management decisions. And so knowing what we know, at least about land tenure and other disciplines, we know that ecosystem services and the values they provide for people are strongly influenced by land management decisions, as well as land rights and resource tenure rights. And so land tenure security is a key factor, an underlying factor that can determine the success of these multilateral initiatives. And again, the literature is well established for the connections between land tenure security and human well-being. It's been linked to improvements in land values, improved access to credit. It's been shown that strengthening tenure can improve agricultural productivity. And we've also seen that improving land tenure security can reduce uncertainty for landholders and also support economic development. But the big question here is, how does this all relate to conservation outcomes? And the evidence here is mixed. We see that it can have positive effects. Some studies show positive, little to no effect, and it can even have a negative, perverse outcomes to what we expect. And really what these mixed outcomes tell us is that land tenure security empowers a landholder with choices, right? It creates a whole new world of choices, of actions that they may take on their land, but these choices may or may not benefit conservation. And so we need to think about this in a consistent way and interrogate those choices about what outcomes can we reasonably expect for conservation. And so our goal with this paper was to provide an overview of the literature that can help the conservation community think about these issues and how better to integrate land tenure security into our conservation work. First of all, I think it's beneficial for us to distinguish between land tenure form and land tenure security. And land tenure forms really determines who can use what resources for what period of time and under what conditions. Whereas land tenure security, on the other hand, is about the assurance that the actual landholder feels that those property rights will be upheld by society, irrespective of what bundle of rights might be associated with that tenure form. So if we take a quick look at land tenure form, this can be summarized into a table, and this is a table that we generated based on our literature review results. As you can see in the literature, land tenure form is generally characterized as some very simple categories that we're familiar with across the top: private, communal, customary or traditional, protected and public. And then across the column down the bottom there, we see the different types of rights. We can refer to these as a bundle of rights that may be associated with a particular tenure form. Access, withdrawal for either commercial or subsistence reasons, management, exclusion, which is the right to refuse entry, alienation, which is the right to buy or sell the property, and due process, which is the right to having your grievances adjudicated and getting fair compensation. And so for any particular tenure form, you can see that it's associated with some bundles of rights. Private tenure, of course, which we classically tend to associate with a full set of rights in the classic sense. Communal tenure, which we took there from Schlager and Ostrom, that definition, which generally excludes alienation and due process. And then customary traditional, which tends to encompass a variety of arrangements, but we found from our literature that it almost always includes access or withdrawal rights. And then for lands under, oops, did I miss one? Yeah, so. Land under government protected areas or public protected areas. I think we're missing the table. Let me see. These also have their classification, but in general, these don't include exclusion and alienation or due process rights. We also included public land there as a category that often used to designate undocumented lands in developing countries. So I think we have a slight error in this table, but please do look up the full paper. It's available now on conservation letters, which will define that. I'm not going to spend too much time because we need to move on. So if we think back to land tenure security, land tenure form only indirectly connects to land tenure security. And if we think about security, again, what we mentioned, it's about how the landowner feels about whether those rights will be upheld, whether that belief is just perceived or real. And I'll run through that. So the tenure security is affected by a variety of categories. We include political economy, formal institutions, and informal institutions, all of which influence the landowner's perception of tenure security and ultimately the decisions that they take and the outcomes, whether those be for human well-being or conservation outcomes. And then if we think how those relate to conservation, if we look at the arrow number A there, it can be a situation where tenure security only alone impacts conservation outcomes. So for an example, if we take, we have one of our working group members who's done some work in Ecuador, the situation where formal titling of the land provides positive outcomes for protected forested areas in Ecuador. And then it can work in the opposite direction, that's arrow B, where the actual land decisions that we take or the conservation intervention can impact the tenure security. So for example, in Africa, in some regions, planting trees can be a way of demarcating the land, setting boundaries, and in fact, asserting some level of rights. And for the conservation interventions, what do we need to think about? We need to consider both of these pathways. Whenever we do an intervention, we need to be aware that this can work in both directions. We can have both influencing tenure security and being influenced by tenure security. And from an analytical perspective, we can think about it as an expected utility function. We have some intervention or treatment, and we generate those private or returns and externalities. So what's the takeaway message here is that secure tenure can decrease uncertainty in investment for landholders and conservation practitioners, and we need to be prepared to put in the effort to clarify those informal, formal, or those factors that influence tenure security. And then we also need to be aware of the level of tenure security that's needed to secure conservation and human well-being objectives, and that inequalities might result from interactions between our conservation, intervention, and tenure security. Okay, how am I doing for time? Oh, okay, it's like my last slide. Speeding through it. So to wrap it up, we didn't want to just leave it hanging. This is our first foray into this, but we want to leave you with some action items of what we think is relevant and takeaway actions that we can take with us to our different conservation contexts. And the first one here is, let's assess the baseline socioeconomic political situation and underlying tenure security issues. And that's understanding our tenure security context when we're thinking about interventions, and examine how varying degrees of tenure security might interact with our conservation programs that are under consideration. And then if we find an intervention that we think is worthwhile pursuing, organizations, we need to consider the implications for marginalized and vulnerable groups who are often disproportionately impacted by conservation outcomes, particularly with the different forces that are at play with tenure security. We find that different subpopulations have differential impacts related to the tenure security. And then in light of these underlying tenure security issues, organizations to reassess the likelihood of an intervention achieving desired outcomes. So when we do go into the field with our interventions or strategies that we've developed, we need to think about, given our tenure security context, are we likely to achieve the outcomes that we're expecting? So I'm just going to wrap it up there and let you all know that the paper actually has just been published. It's out in Conservation Letters. So if you're interested in seeing a full breakdown of the tools that we presented here and the framework, that's all available in the paper, along with some supplementary materials that provide some examples of how you might apply that table to your own conservation context. Thank you. Okay. So I think we're going to do questions? All right, so if questions? Yeah. The paper name is Integrating Land Tenure Security into Conservation. So a little different. Yes.
Land tenure. Thank you. The impacts of conservation on land tenure often work over kind of long timescales and things, and as you mentioned, through indirect routes, whereas in conservation, impacts are often assessed on a very short-term scale, perhaps, or in a one-off way rather than adaptively. How do you address this in the paper? I should ask.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a shot at it, and if any of the other working group members want to add to it as well. So the way we sort of address that is acknowledging that there's a huge suite of factors that interplay. So that was the left-hand side of that diagram, these political macroeconomic factors. And if we can do some assessment of your tenure security environment and the land rights environment at the start of a project, so you know what kind of context you're entering into, and then as you do your work and do your intervention, kind of keep an assessment of that, of how you might expect outcomes to play out given that context. It's still a first foray for us, but I think what we're trying to say is that that's what we need to dive into. We certainly need more research in that area to understand how can we get the learning that we need to be able to adapt. And I think that's a key question about how do we balance the different time frames of which these impacts might happen. All right, so I think we're going to hand off to the next speaker, and that'll be Alison Kelly, who's going to talk about the tenure gap.
Hi, everyone. So I'm taking over this presentation from Yuta Masuda, who's at the Nature Conservancy. I'm a PhD candidate at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. So Jessica has really set us up nicely for talking about the other two research products that have come out of this working group with the Nature Conservancy. And so during that work, we came across the need to have more nuanced discussions about tenure. So just measuring statutory rights or the existence of legal title doesn't capture the complexity of this concept sufficiently. So we want to emphasize that the emergence of land tenure security comes from all of these contextual factors that we saw in that framework. And one of the specific sources that was highlighted during discussions with the experts in the working group was when there's an incongruence between the statutory rights that exist in a location and the socially defined rights in that location. And this is something that is anecdotally mentioned in the literature, but we hadn't seen measured quantitatively. So we developed the schematic that you see here in order to dive into the nuance of this issue. And so the concept of the tenure gap is that if you have the first arrow that moves downward, so if you have statutory rights but that aren't being enforced on the ground, that can create tenure insecurity. And conversely, in the other direction, if there are socially defined rights or traditional knowledge that isn't being recognized, isn't codified into law or recognized in the statutory rights, that can also lead to tenure insecurity. And so we took the approach of measuring this gap using the disaggregated bundle of rights approach from Schlager and Ostrom and the Rights and Resources Initiative. And so our primary research questions were, where does this kind of a gap exist and how severe is that gap? And what are some of the priority approaches for narrowing that gap or closing that gap if possible? And so we went about this by creating a survey which was conducted via Skype with land tenure experts in 10 different countries. So it was a structured survey which also included a mapping component which we used Amigo Cloud to collect data on. So we had a standard recruitment email, reminder emails, and we drew from organizations that the experts of our tenure working group had connections with, and we also drew from agendas from the Land and Poverty Conference that the World Bank holds every year, which is a large collection of tenure security experts from all over the world. So we had sort of 3 regional focuses, South America and Central America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And on average, these were really in-depth, sort of intensive interviews for our enumerators, which on average were it took about 2 hours to explore one case. So we collected a lot of very detailed information. So who did we interview? We ended up completing 60 interviews. The highest number of respondents were from Guatemala, India, Colombia, and Indonesia. The experts averaged about 15 years of experience working on land tenure issues in those areas. Most held postgraduate degrees, and their most common role is executive director of a land tenure organization. Excuse me. And the most common sector that they reported working in was conservation, followed by economic development, and there was also a strong focus on indigenous groups and agriculture. And so, the expert, there was actually a lot of overlap. So the experts had multiple sectoral focuses, and they also filled more than one role in their organizations commonly. So, like I said, we collected this data in a disaggregated way. So the table that you saw in the previous presentations, which showed the form of tenure, as well as the rights we might expect that form of tenure to provide. So the respondents provided us with the tenure form for the subpopulation that they worked with, which is shown here in this bar graph. So across the bottom, we have the same forms that map to the table that we saw previously. So private, communal, customary, protected area, and public. And this shows them disaggregated by region. We get a lot of questions about that communal customary overlap, and there is quite a lot of overlap in those 2 categories. there isn't a standardized definition in the literature, so this is a self-reported, so what the expert would have chosen to call that type of, or that form of tenure. And so some of the expectations that we had about where we might see this gap more or less are laid out here. So within communal and customary lands, we would expect potentially more locally recognized rights than statutory rights. So we might expect the gap, to see a gap there across the rights. And we also might expect, mainly because we can see that in Latin America, that communal form of tenure is actually a little bit more common than in other parts of the world. And it's also, at least in my personal experience in Mexico, it's often codified into law. So there's sort of a legal definition of that in some countries. So we'd expect that the communal gap would be slightly smaller than the customary gap based on that knowledge that we have. We would also expect protected areas and public lands to have more statutory rights and fewer socially defined rights potentially. And then we would expect the smallest gap to be in private rights. We saw in that table that private rights generally confer the entire bundle of rights in a location, so there shouldn't be much of a distinction between the two. So this is a lot of information, bear with me for a second, please. So again, we have across the top the tenure form. And during the survey we asked so using that schematic that I showed at the beginning of how we conceptualize the tenure gap, we asked the respondents to tell us in the specific subpopulation within the tenure form if the community had a socially defined right. And we went through each right, and the expert had a table with the definitions of all of these rights so that they could refer to that. And we did that twice. We did that once for socially defined rights, and then we did that again for legally defined rights. And I should say that before we did this in a disaggregated way, we asked them if this gap in rights existed where they worked. And 97% of subpopulations, there was a gap in rights. So we went through the same process twice for each, for both socially defined and legally defined rights. So this graph shows, so panel C shows socially defined rights that aren't matched in the legal context. And we can see, sort of as we expected, the largest gap that we find is that there are a lot of socially defined rights within that customary tenure form that aren't matched in the legal system. And that's sort of the standout message from panel C. In panel D, we see where there are legally defined rights, but they aren't matched socially. And so I guess the takeaway there is that big bar that sticks out in protected areas, which we were actually a little bit surprised by, that there are access rights in protected areas that maybe the communities aren't aware of or aren't taking advantage of. I'm going to speed up here a little bit because so anyway, this is an illustration of a quantitative measure of that gap. And shown in a different way, this is where those rights are matched. So they report having both the social and legally defined right. And we can see here, as we sort of expected, for the private form of tenure, it has the most, the rights that are the most congruent. And again, we see customary sort of lower than communal, but both lower than private. And so we also asked about where this gap exists, what were the largest challenges both for the local communities and environmentally. And the most commonly reported social outcome from this gap was conflict, which is an additional source of land tenure insecurity. And we also saw dispossession was also one of the reported outcomes. The most highly reported outcome for the natural environment was deforestation. So this gap is leading to insecure, well, we theorize that this gap is leading to insecure tenure, which is then affecting the amount of deforestation as reported by the experts. So we also had a qualitative discussion with these experts about what they're doing, how they're working in the field to improve tenure security and hopefully to minimize this gap in rights. And the most commonly reported activity was improving governance capacity as we saw in that framework, one of the sort of pillars of the emergence of tenure security is having a government that's able to defend that right for a right holder. So that was one of the primary activities that experts were working on. And the other one that we see here is working at the community level, so working on community agreements or promoting communal tenure, so to codify those socially defined rights into the legal system. So our big takeaways from this are that we're exploring these more nuanced strategies for how to measure this gap, and this, to our knowledge, is the first attempt to quantitatively measure this gap, which is recognized in the literature. And through that process, hopefully gain some insight about how we might be able to close that gap to minimize the tenure insecurity that it leads to, and hopefully improve outcomes for both communities and the ecosystems where they live. And we think that understanding both the socially defined and statutorily defined rights is an important step for conservation interventions, because it begins to disaggregate to provide a more nuanced measure of tenure security in an area, and hopefully provide us a better context for thinking about these issues. So I think I'll stop there since I'll be up here for a while. So again, thanks.
Were there any specific causes of dispossession? That was one issue that...
No, so that was we offered that as a category of selection. Off the top of my head, in the qualitative findings, I don't have any insight on that, no. Yeah, sorry. Are we behind time?
Thanks a lot. That was really interesting. I was just going to ask, I guess implicitly then the question is like, why? What are the reasons for that gap? And because you were mentioning, how can we close it? So I was just going to say, obviously there's lots of political pressures and and I guess strategies. I guess it can be part of a strategy for reaching certain goals, for making sure that that gap isn't closed. So there's, political pressures, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that last graph that I showed is where we're starting to think about that, is we're trying to think about, how to close that gap. And one of the ways that, like as we saw, one of the largest categories of activities that they're doing is working with the local government to improve capacity, but there are also obviously large-scale land titling initiatives globally that, if done well and if recognizing those socially defined and customary rights, would also contribute to closing that gap. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next presentation, I think. Okay, great. Hi, still here. The other product from this working group that we wanted to talk about is this index that we've created, that we've been developing as part of the working group's work. So as we've seen, land tenure security has these recognized benefits for human well-being. And though it has an ambiguous relationship with conservation outcomes, we know that it's a prerequisite for these sort of market mechanism-based conservation objectives like PES and REDD+, and is also integral to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so when we started our work, we were interested in doing a broad-scale mapping exercise to see where priority areas for research on land tenure security as it relates to conservation and human well-being might be. And when we went to look for this kind of data, we found that there's a real lack of a global index that explicitly measures land tenure security, owing to the fact that it's a complex topic and quite difficult to measure. But we think it's critical for both for research needs and also for global planning needs to have a measure of tenure security that you can incorporate into quantitative representations at the global scale and larger scale decision-making analyses. So Jessica showed this framework a little bit earlier, and and it's based on an extensive review of that disparate literature that she mentioned, as well as expert input from our working group members. And what we focused on was that left-hand side of the figure, so all of those elements that we think contribute to the emergence of tenure security in an area, and which are that political economy, formal institutional and informal institutional components. And so what we went about doing is looking at the two elements that we feel that we can represent at the global scale. So we're not incorporating informal institutions here, just due to the subnational variability that we expect to find, as well as that it's different for different subpopulations. So we're more focusing on that political economic context and the formal institutions that exist in a country at the national level. So we did find a few indices that start to get at this topic. Most of them focused explicitly on property rights, the top few that are listed there. And there was one layer, the insecure tenure and property rights layer that ARD and USAID had done in 2005 that was explicitly looking at tenure security. So that map is shown here. And so some of the limitations for this methodology were that it was based on expert elicitation exercises, so the data aren't regionally comparable. And additionally, as you can see, it doesn't have global coverage. So for the index that we set about creating, we wanted to expand that global coverage and have a transparent construction approach. And another issue with this map is that it's no longer pursued as a research program, so the 2005 version is the only that exists. Yet it's reproduced in several places, and it's often the first thing you find when you go to look for this data. So we were hoping to improve on this existing data source with the index that we created. And so using the framework, that left-hand side of the framework, we went to the literature to look for definitions and ways to measure these concepts. So we drew on the political science, public policy literatures to define these elements. And then we did a review of existing data sources that might be used as proxies for those elements. So within the political economic component, we include political capacity, political will, and the presence of conflict. And within the formal institutions, we include the capacity to adjudicate, exclusion authority and ability, and the governance capacity. So then we took all 6 of these elements and scaled them to a 0-1 scale and just took an average to create our index. We relied on the average because there isn't enough evidence in the literature to support weighting one of these more or less currently. So we didn't make any assumptions about their relative importance in this index. And so as seen here, we first calculated that political economic component, the formal institutions context, and then the governance context for land tenure security is shown here. So in this map, the green areas are a stronger context for supporting the emergence of land tenure security, while the red are a weaker context for supporting the emergence of land tenure security. But again, this doesn't capture that informal institutions component, so some of this may be offset by strong socially defined rights in an area which we know may happen in some of the customary systems in Africa. So with this index, we wanted to begin to understand how it might be used to help us prioritize areas for further research or for conservation projects. And so we started just by looking at its correlation with indicators of human well-being. And we found, as we had seen in the literature, land tenure security is positively related for positive human well-being outcomes. And this index is positively correlated with several measures of human well-being outcomes, like the Human Development Index and access to clean water. So that knowing that that was the case in the literature helped us validate these outcomes. And so as a diagnostic exercise to sort of understand how we might use this layer in global planning exercises, we undertook sort of a simplified example of how we can use this index. And so here we showed the extent of the index within remaining intact forest areas. So this is revealing areas where we have remaining intact forests, which may be a priority conservation area, but we have a weaker context for land tenure security. So as the framework sort of that Jessica presented on gives you an idea of how tenure security may be interacting with these conservation objectives, this is highlighting areas where we would expect that tenure security would be weaker. So shown a different way, this is just a binned. This is the proportion of remaining intact forest binned by the index value. And we see this bimodal distribution, but with the majority of remaining intact forest area in a weaker governance context for the emergence of land tenure security. And so there's this large overlap of areas where we think there's a weaker context for the emergence of security and areas that are of primary conservation interest. And then, sorry guys. Another aspect of this index is that because of the transparent construction approach, we can look at the components of the index for a given country. So here I show Guatemala and Suriname, which are both countries that have some area of remaining intact forest. And we see that they both have an aggregate score of 0.44 on our index, but that the composition of those 6 elements we're using to create it is a little bit different. So relative to Suriname, Guatemala is a little bit stronger on the ease of registering property rights and the strength of property rights, whereas it's relatively weaker in political stability and rule of law. So being able to do this high-level analysis of sort of the potential sources of weak land tenure security may lead you to make sort of different prescriptive large-scale intervention approaches. For example, the focus in Suriname may be oriented more towards improving the land registration process or ensuring landholders are able to defend their rights, while the focus in Guatemala may be more politically focused, working to reduce corruption or to ensure that existing rights are maintained. So to wrap up this, we think that the Governance Context for Land Tenure Security Index is an important contribution because there isn't currently a global layer that measures this concept. So we've, using a parsimonious data set with a transparent construction method, we've also, and an expanded global coverage, we've created this index. We found it to be correlated with human well-being indicators, and we've shown a simplified example of how it can be used to overlay with areas of conservation priority and to highlight areas of potential further evaluation. And we also think that it can aid in global scale development planning programs, which we've already had a little bit of interest from some organizations. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you think there's a way of going beyond the country level with this index?
Like a deeper dive?
Yeah, in a spatially explicit way.
We started with a much more complex approach that did have, we do think that there is a way. And we've looked at a few ways, but we weren't satisfied with the ones that we had created thus far. But we are looking at a couple of options, like maybe incorporating human threat into it a little bit, so like urbanization and maybe population density are some of the ones that we've had in before and taken out. So, but yeah, there's definitely potential for doing some sort of subnational variation. Or just combining it with those data sets and not directly incorporating them into the index itself.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering a little bit about the data that went into scoring each indicator. I work in the marine world, and I'm thinking this would be really interesting to be able to do for like marine tenure rights, but the data
Yeah.
would be a significant barrier.
Yeah, so we used a lot, so we used all existing data sources, many of which are produced by the World Bank. And I guess with marine, your challenge is that all of this is sort of terrestrially focused. And we haven't considered incorporating marine, but that is a very interesting potential expansion. I don't think I have any data sources that might push us there. Yeah. So we did a huge review of the existing available literature, data sources, and settled on the World Bank and Transparency International and the few other ones that you saw there. Yeah. Okay, great.
So is this everything automatically up there?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right, hi, I'm Kelly Jones. I'm a professor at Colorado State University, and I'm going to be moving away from kind of these broader concepts and really diving into an application where we did an evaluation looking at what is the impact of formalizing tenure on forest conservation in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. This is definitely joint work. We have an interdisciplinary team from the US and from Ecuador. So I won't go too much into the background because we already heard a good overview from Jessica and also from Allison. But the gist is that we don't have a good theory on what formalizing land tenure would do to forest cover. And in our case, we're looking specifically at titling as a way to formalize tenure and to strengthen tenure security. So there could be a positive effect, there could be a negative effect, there could be no change in forest cover before and after a titling program. And there's very few impact evaluations that can help us predict what that effect might be in a specific context, and what are the different factors that might influence whether it's positive or negative or neutral. And so the goal of our study was to add to this evidence base, specifically in the Amazonian and Ecuadorian Amazon. And so we have two questions, and they're kind of sequential. So we had the opportunity to look at a formal titling campaign and test what's the impact of getting title on forest outcomes. And then because Ecuador has a national forest conservation incentives program, or the term that you may be more familiar with is a payment for ecosystem services program, we were able to study, well, if you receive title and then you're eligible to enroll in PS and you choose to enroll, what's the impact of enrolling in that program on forest outcomes? And so we do this through impact evaluation methods. But we wanted to complement the what is the effect, or is there an effect, with more qualitative information on why might we be seeing an effect. So we also do 15 focus group interviews in our study area to try and understand what is the pathways, right, that might be leading to any outcomes we detect. So I probably don't need to tell this crowd that the Amazon is a critical area for biodiversity and ecosystem services, so an important research site. I do want to just say a couple things about where we're focused. So we're around Coyabeno Reserve, which is in the northeastern corner of Ecuador, and it's the darker gray that you see on this map. And just point out that the boundaries of this protected area have shifted over time, from its creation in 1979 to an expansion in 1991. And then you see around what they call kind of the head of the reserve, the boundary actually shrunk in the 90s. And this is directly related to tenure conflicts. So when this park was established, there were people living in the park. This is very common in South America. And around the head of the reserve, there were colonists or settlers that had migrated to the area. And what happened in '94 is that there was so much deforestation that had already occurred and so much land conflict that they took what was a strict protected area and they changed the designation to multiple use protected area, and recognizing that people are living here and using the forest actively. So that's the area that we focus on in this study. So there's been recognition by the Ecuadorian government of the tenure conflicts around this park for some time. In the early 2000s, they got money from IDB to do a formal land titling project. And so the map you see is around the head of that reserve, and you see the different parcels that became titled for these settlers that were living in and around the protected area. And I don't know how well you can see the colors, but the light purple are where they formally got title. There were about 1,060 communities that got a title as of 2009. And about 900, most of these overlap with this multiple use designation, and that's called patrimony forest in Ecuador. And that's important because if you overlap with multiple use protected area, your title came with restrictions. And the restriction was you had to conserve at least 70% of the forest on your land. And we'll come back to that point. About 300 of the parcels in these communities did not get titled, and that's for various reasons, like they weren't present during the campaign or the program, or they didn't have all the official paperwork needed. So that's one policy tool we're going to look at. And then as I mentioned, we also want to look at if you get formal title and then you have the option to enroll in this national PES program or Forest Conservation Incentives Program, what happens to forest cover on your parcel. So you can see the kind of bright purple. Those are the parcels that enrolled in our study area as of 2010 in this national FCI program known as Sociobosque in Ecuador. And all of those settlers or colonists that enrolled overlap with this multiple use protected area designation, which makes sense, right? You already have restrictions, so why not enroll in a program that's going to pay you to conserve your forest? So we want to do an impact evaluation. We'd like to know the counterfactual effect of these two policies. Of course, we can never observe what would have happened without the policies. So we have to go and construct a good control group, and we also want to pay attention to the fact that deforestation in the Amazon is very dynamic, so we want to look temporally at what happens before and after these two policies take place. And we're able to do that by combining two impact evaluation methods. We use matching, specifically propensity score matching, to create the best control group of parcels that don't get titled or don't enroll in Sociobosque. And then we use a difference in difference or a Bakke approach to estimate the impact of the policy. And we do this through a linear fixed effects panel regression method. We're using spatial data for our impact evaluation, so we have the individual parcel boundaries from the IDB project, and this is a nice advantage over a lot of these spatial evaluations that have to use a pixel or a arbitrary grid cell, so we know the household boundary. We use percent forest loss from 2001 to 2014. This is a Landsat-derived forest change project, or product, excuse me. And then we have our two treatments, right, our two policy variables we want to test. And then we have a number of covariates derived from geospatial data. So what do we find? So first we'll look at the land titling and forest loss, and we'll look at it visually. So if you look at those parcels that received title after 2009, they're in the solid black line, and you look at parcels that didn't receive title, they're in the dashed or dotted line. You see that prior to getting title, they actually trend very similarly in their deforestation patterns. So this suggests that those that got title versus those that didn't are quite similar in terms of pressures on the land. But when you look post-2009 after receiving title, you see a noticeable shift down for those that received title versus those that didn't receive title. This looks very promising for forest conservation, right? That getting a title may have decreased deforestation. And in fact, when we implement our impact evaluation methods, we do find with the full set of parcels, there's a statistically significant effect, this is at the 99% level, that you have a decrease of about 0.4 percentage points if you receive title versus not receiving title over the time period 2010 to 2014. Now, when we separate this out with the overlap with patrimony forest land and multiple use land, we see that that effect is driven specifically by overlapping with multiple use forest land. So that second row in the results, you see that it's statistically significant if you're on multiple use forest land and get a title, but if you aren't on that multiple use forest land and you get a title, there's no change in your deforestation pattern. All right, let's look at the results from enrolling in Sociobosque or the FCI program. Here again, visually, you can see that prior to enrolling, the dashed line here are the parcels that ended up enrolling after they got title. You can see they already had lower deforestation before enrolling in socio-bosque. And again, this is very similar to what we find in the literature, that most parcels of land going into PES have lower kind of pressure in terms of deforestation drivers. But we do see that after 2010, if you enroll in socio-bosque, it does look like there's a noticeable decrease in your deforestation pressure. Again, very promising. It looks like this PES program may be having an effect on deforestation. So when we do our impact evaluation, we confirm that, and we do find a statistically significant impact of enrolling in PES, decreasing deforestation on average by about 0.4 percentage points over this time period. Okay, so I mentioned we also wanted to know, well, what's actually happening? Why might we be seeing these results through these focus group interviews? So we did 15 interviews across the 60 communities. So is this plausible? In terms of land titling, we heard that most people felt they had really strong de facto tenure security prior to titling. And there's some other literature in Ecuador and Peru that shows that colonists and indigenous communities have strong de facto rights. This may explain why if you're not on the patrimony forest land and you receive title, there's no change in your deforestation rate, right? Because your tenure security was pretty strong before you got a formal title. Second point, we do find that people on the multiple use forest land kind of find out for the first time that there were these restrictions on what they could do on their land, that they could only cut up to 30% of the forest. Not surprisingly, people were not very happy about this restriction, right? Very negative views that they weren't allowed to do what they wanted with their land. There were some other restrictions, things on how you could, whether or not you could subdivide your land, whether you could sell it. So people weren't very happy with this. Yet, they had an increased recognition of the restrictions, and this may explain why that overlap with multiple use land, you do see a decrease in deforestation after getting title, right? Because they now have the information and are aware of the restrictions. And then finally, there was increased recognition that now that they have title, they could get credit from a bank or they can enroll in programs like the PES program. But overall, very few people had taken advantage of these opportunities. In terms of the PES program or FCI program, we found that most people said they weren't using the land they enrolled that extensively before enrolling. And this kind of shows up in our visual as well. But that most people were enrolling because it was an alternative source of income. They were older, they had more land, they didn't want to have to even do small-scale logging or subsistence agriculture on that plot. So plausibly, people were kind of shifting out of land use into other activities or using this as an alternative income source. The third point, another possibility is that people mention increased enforcement on their property if they enrolled in socio-bosque for two reasons. One, they're required by the program to put up signs and boundaries. And so if you've ever walked through the Amazon forest or any forest, you know it's kind of hard to know where your boundary ends and another one begins, right? So there might just have been an increased recognition of those parcels from their neighbors. And they also said that the Ministry of Environment had increased enforcement of parcels enrolled in socio-bosque, possibly because they want to make sure they're getting something for their investment. And then a final point that was interesting to us is there was very low interest in this region to enroll in the PES program. Right? Given the restrictions on how much you could cut, you'd think everyone would want to get paid to have to conserve. But people really were distrustful of the program because they distrusted the government, and they were not happy with the fact that the program in Ecuador has 20-year contract periods, and there was just too restrictive for them to lock their land up for this long. So just some key final points. We do find in this study that formalizing tenure through titling can have a conservation effect under these two conditions. One, there's kind of forest-friendly restrictions on how much land a household can actually cut, or they enroll in some type of direct payment to conserve forests. We don't find an effect otherwise, and it probably has to do with the fact that de facto tenure security is quite strong in this region. Of course, we can't say which of these policies or programs would be best because we didn't evaluate things like the equity or welfare implications, which would obviously differ across these two types of programs, and the cost of implementing these two types of programs would be very different. And just as a final point, we do think that this impact evaluation combined with qualitative interviews really adds to the evidence, but we need to continue to try and investigate the causal mechanisms of why we see tenure security or change in tenure security leading to increases or decreases or neutral effects on forest cover. We actually have a PhD student right now who's gathering enforcement data, right, so that we can actually say, is that the story Is that what's leading to changes in or lowering deforestation? And then finally, just the importance of longitudinal and long-term impacts. These were pretty short. We were only looking 3 to 5 years after the policies were implemented. You should expect that changes in tenure security are going to have a dynamic effect on forest cover, right? Depending on the opportunities that present themselves to those landholders. So we'd like to go back in 5 years or so when we have more data and say, is this effect the same or has it changed over time? With that, thanks. And we were lucky enough to have our 2 papers on this study published just a couple months ago. So if you want to read more about this case study, just look up our publications. So thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. I was wondering whether you asked any questions about how clarifying land tenure impacted trends of rural to urban migration. You mentioned that some of the participants were getting older. Did you think that having secure land tenure made them feel more easy about letting their kids go and move to the city?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I can answer it directly. I do know that the region we're working in is really remote, right? And so there's not a lot of large cities, but a lot of people already live in small towns and just go to their fields to do the work. So I do think it gave people security to go to those smaller towns. Right? Previously, people would say that they'd have a little kind of, small hut or house out on their parcel while they were doing their agriculture or their logging, and then go in the city. And this, I think, was allowing them to stay in, as we call it, a town, a couple thousand people, versus having to live in this kind of more remote area. I think the big implication for the children is going to be the fact that they can't subdivide their land. And I think that's what everyone was most worried about, is what are we going to do when we have multiple children and only one person can inherit this land legally. So,
Thanks so much for your talk. So you mentioned that the boundary of the park changed in the 90s. I wonder, although this was before your study period, I wonder if there was any impact of that boundary change on the ground, or whether there were already people in the region, so there wasn't much of a real change in terms of forest cover.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's always been deforestation going on in the head of that boundary, and there was a study, why they kind of shrunk it, like I said, is they moved it to multiple use area, recognizing that people were living there. They also encourage these communities to kind of form, they call them pre-cooperatives, but this kind of structure where they're working together in the idea that they would eventually get these individual land titles. So this was almost like a precursor to the land titling program. It just took about 20 years for that to happen. But there was a remote sensing study done, so they didn't use impact evaluation methods. They weren't trying to control for some of these maybe other confounding factors, but they just looked at land cover change, forest cover change over, I think it was 3 decades. I could find the paper for you. I think it's cited probably in one of, if not both of these. And they do find that deforestation decreased a bit once they kind of recognize these pre-cooperatives and these communities were living in this multiple use area. They did start to see a decrease in deforestation using that remote sensing data. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Time for one more question. So that was a really interesting talk. I was wondering if you go back to the plot with the tenure that shows before and after.
The graph or the
yeah,
map?
that one. Yeah, the graph.
Okay.
So just sort of eyeballing it, it looks almost as though deforestation kind of stays relatively constant before 2009, and suddenly deforestation increases in the no title zone. Could that be, is it like leakage, or is it people seeing other people getting titling? Any idea what's going on there?
Yeah, so we did want to explore that. Look, and that's again a reason to have temporal data, right? You see that everything's shifting up, right? And if you just drew a line through both, there's kind of a general shift in increased deforestation over our time period. And we did look at, we expanded, it's in the paper, I think in the Global Environmental Change paper, we looked at the whole province and kind of deforestation trends, and it looks like over this time period in post 2009, 2010, deforestation is increasing on average in the province. So there's obviously some other underlying drivers that have increased deforestation on average in these later years that we're picking up in this data set. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Chloe Wardropper. I'm a postdoc at Purdue University with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm shifting here to a US context. I'm looking at soil health on rented farmland in the US. So the issue, as we're all concerned about, is how tenure relationships affect social and environmental outcomes, whether that be in natural lands or farmland in my context. And so there's evidence that incentives to farm sustainably are reduced when tenure is uncertain. And so in the US, there's been shown to be lower adoption of conservation practices on rented farmlands. And this plays out over quite a large area. The farmland in the Midwest, which is where most of our cash crops are grown, is over 50% rented. And yet there's little empirical research on the tenure relationship in this context, and there's not a lot also studying the effects of different approaches to try to get more conservation on farmland, persuading the owners or the operators to implement conservation practices. So the project that I'm working on is in process, so I'm reporting interim results, and the project is taking a few unique approaches. We're testing conservation adoption based on behavior change theory. And we are doing a large-scale field experiment, which isn't common in the US and in other contexts in terms of tenure, impacts of tenure. There are over 6,500 people who will be enrolled in our trial. And we're producing both conservation and science outcomes through this applied project. So we're interested in testing the effectiveness of common approaches to influence pro-conservation behavior that are used by conservation organizations, both governmental and non-governmental. And we're testing them in the context of the landlord-tenant relationship in agriculture. And so these include promoting awareness and concern through education, yet research has shown that there's not a clear link between more information and actual action, right? Another approach is incentivizing behavior, so changing the cost-benefit analysis for the person being targeted, regardless of how they feel about the conservation activity. And nudging behavior, which is increasingly being tried by organizations. It changes the construct of the choice. So, for instance, a nudge could be putting trash cans in a city, and as long as it's just as easy to throw trash in the trash can as on the ground, it can reduce littering. So this is a cheap way to try to create change. And so we are testing the relative effectiveness in this population of these three approaches through a couple of phases. First, we're sending out recruitment messages to 6,500 non-operating farmland owners to look at the effect of just information versus different framings of benefits or losses that could be gained or lost by improving soil health. And then we're testing assistance of those people who enroll in our program. We're testing these three types of approaches. So the behavior that we're trying to influence is cover crops on land where corn and soybeans are grown. In this context, these are plants like rye or clover that provide cover over the winter and prevent runoff, increase water holding capacity, and other environmental benefits. Yet there's a very low adoption of cover crops in the US. It's only around 5%, and it's lower on rented lands. So this is a great area for improvement. TNC and other conservation organizations have been putting a lot of focus on the Mississippi River Basin in the US. All of whose runoff goes into the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a very large eutrophication zone. So that's in yellow there. And so we use data on the percent rented lands by county, croplands, and and nitrogen runoff in order to find our target area, which is these 3 states, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, where we're trying to enroll non-operating landowners or absentee landowners in our program. So there are over 125,000 of these non-operating farmland owners here. And these owners have fairly similar demographics across these 3 states. On average, they own about 450 acres of farmland. They're 65 years old, which is about 10 years older than the average operator or farmer. And they're almost 40% female, which is much higher than the average operator. So already you can see in terms of the age and the gender, there are some potential barriers to communication between owners and operators. So this is just an overview of our whole project, and I've talked about the population. We did a stratified random sample to get 6,500 non-operating landowners who we're targeting first with our messaging phase. So we are sending out postcards to these people, 9 different messages, and we're asking them to send a postcard back if they're interested in learning more about soil health. And the baseline for this assessment is a short survey where we ask, have they had cover crops on their land in the past? What's their communication like with their farmer? And have they had financial assistance before? So if they reply to our initial mailing, they'll be enrolled in our main trial program, which is also an experiment in which we're testing those 3 types of approaches to influencing behavior. So the information only, the financial incentive, and the nudge. And in this case, the nudge is a lease amendment because, as we've learned, leases are really key to this tenure relationship in the US. And I should say the eventual outcome will be measured using remote sensing to understand the change in cover crop planting. So before we even developed our mailers, we did baseline interviews with 40 non-operating landowners and their tenants and other conservation staff to ask what kinds of barriers exist to getting cover crops on rented land. And there were a slew of barriers that came up, organized into these 5 categories here. So just briefly, a few of the barriers were these owners tend to be, they're often 2nd generation, so perhaps their parents or their 3rd generation, so their grandparents farmed the land, and now they live far from the land, so they don't have the farming context anymore, or they bought it as investment, so they don't know anything about farming, and that can make conversations difficult between the owner and their tenant. Even if the owner is interested in getting conservation on their land, they might not know how to talk to their tenant about cover crops or other practices. Motivations for owning farmland spanned a wide array, but some of the owners, especially if they were older, were often reliant on their income from their farmland for their retirement. So they often were not able to think about long-term practices. They were only thinking about short-term returns. Lease terms were really crucial here. So historically, these leases have been crop share leases, so the owner and the farmer share both the benefits and any losses of the harvest. But now almost all of the leases are cash leases, so the renter, the farmer, pays a one-time payment to the owner, and so the owner is just less involved in the operation. And also leases tend to be annual rather than multi-year, which tends to disincentivize some of the long-term practices that an operator might implement, like cover crops or like other soil stabilization practices. So these are a few of the things that came up in our interviews, which have informed the rest of our trial program. And so just briefly, we are just about to send out messages to these owners in our sample, and we're interested in testing how to best reach owners to interest them in soil health on their farmland, because this is quite a diverse group of people living all around the US mostly. So we're trying we're sending out 9 mailers, and we're testing a gain versus loss frame. So you are getting benefits from improving soil health on your land versus you could lose those benefits if soil health is degraded. And an altruism versus egoism frame. So you are improving lives and livelihoods, or you are improving your bottom line and your investment. And then our baseline is an information-only mailer. So the business as usual strategy, generally from the Nature Conservancy and other organizations, is to combine altruism and egoism. So you're improving lives and you're improving your bottom line, and focusing on the positive. But there's research from social psychology that suggests that focusing on a loss frame, especially in really concrete situations, could actually catalyze action more effectively. So we want to really get to the bottom of how we can best message to these non-operating landowners. So the expected impact from this project, and I just briefly overviewed it, is to get robust evidence for the best strategies to engage and influence landowners, and to overcome those barriers in the landlord-tenant relationship related to getting conservation on the ground. And then creating information and tools and assistance to improve decision-making on rented land, and ultimately improving soil health and water quality. So I need to thank my project collaborators. Sheila Reddy is the TNC lead on this project, and Linda Prokopi is the lead at Purdue University. We have lots of partners in this project, including the US Department of Agriculture and State Extension. So thank you all. Well, we could open it up to everyone, because we have 5 minutes for general discussion.
For the work in Ecuador, do you see any differences between the recent colonists and the, I don't know what you call them, native, indigenous people? And are you kind of documenting? Or?
So this study was specifically about the colonists. And so most of these people migrated, or even in many cases the government relocated them to this region in the late 70s and 80s. So very different deforestation trends have been documented in the literature. And actually I wasn't part of the assessment, but some of my colleagues published a paper. It's Holland and All Its World Development Paper 2014, where they looked, just looking at kind of
I don't think, oh, okay, it's working now. This question was sort of inspired by the Ecuador talk, but I'd love to hear all of your guys' thoughts on it. I'm wondering if you saw the plenary talk yesterday morning about the perverse results coming from payments for conservation, the discussion about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations for conservation, and how, when basically in a nutshell, when you start paying people for their ecosystem services, it actually has negative impacts for conservation. I just wondered if you guys are looking at that or thinking about that, or if you've had any thoughts on that.
I think in our work in Ecuador, again, it was more surprising to us how few people actually really wanted to engage in these programs. And again, I think that varies across contexts, even within Ecuador and across countries. I'm also doing some work in Mexico, and I know Allison is as well, in ejido communities in PES. And most people, I mean, I haven't done anything that looks explicitly at, are you undermining internal motivations? But the payments, I mean, most people recognize they're really low, and it almost seems to be, I think someone had a framework, it's almost enabling people, right, to kind of do conservation, right? And they were to like to, or in many cases they were doing it previously. This might have a small bump. But I can't say definitively that it's also not going to lead to some perverse consequences. I think we still need a lot of research on that. So I think it's a great point, though, and something to be aware of. Anyone else want to take a shot?
We've not directly worked on this, but we have members in the working group who have focused on some related issues. For instance, members from C4 who've done extensive reviews of RID programs and how those have been working. And again, I think maybe the one finding I can point to, I think recent publication and blog as well coming out of C4 on thinking about the opportunity costs of enrolling in a PES program. Like Kelly just mentioned, you know, in some cases those payments are really low. So are we paying, there's a question of, you know, are you paying enough? What's the opportunity cost of somebody enrolling in that? If I am keeping my trees up versus clearing and doing agriculture or putting in palm oil or something like that, how would those relative returns compare? It's not specifically exactly what you're asking, but again, that's another way that those different tenure forms can play into that.
World Bank or project, then you're really setting it up for a very, it's on a dangerous trajectory, I would think. Unless the governments involved can see a more sustainable way of structuring that PES. I think structuring it perhaps is what long-term structuring. Otherwise, it's playing Russian roulette, I think, with both the people and the forests.
I guess we can wrap it up here, but thank you so much for coming and all your great questions and observations from the talks this morning. And I hope we'll continue to see more conversation about land tenure and land tenure security and the role that it plays in conservation. And I'll just say, you know, keep your eyes out for work coming out from the panelists. I think we'll be excited to share that and also hear perspectives when the papers are published. Thank you.